Hey, it's Allie with Seattle Coffee Gear and Pat, and today we're doing some coffee discussions. In particular, we're focusing on processing and different types of process and what that means.
Yeah, we talk about this a lot of places, but it's more. I think it's a better conversation when you can like actually talk about it and talk about preference a little bit on top of just the very basics about what different processes are.
Totally. Like, honestly, there's probably more than we're going to be covering, but we'll put them into general categories.
Yeah.
And I think like the big three would be washed, the more traditional, honey, which is a little bit more rare, but starting to get a little bit more popular,
Hmm.
and natural.
Yeah. Yeah. And there is the process journey is like one of the great journeys you embark upon when you start learning more about craft coffee and when you start understanding more about how coffee is produced
Why it
and
tastes
everything
the
that
way.
goes through before it gets to the roaster.
Yeah.
And I know we'll kind of define them, but there's that moment that like I think pretty much everybody who gets into coffee has where they have a natural for the first time and then they're like, whoa, that was wild. That was so good. I love that. Why doesn't everyone just only drink this coffee? Or they super hate it. That's the other
Yeah.
option. uh, and then you sort of over time go through like some, you go on a journey, and I think it ends for a lot of people, I shouldn't say ends, but I know for me and for a lot of people, it gets to a point where you're just kind of like, it's all good. There's good and bad coffees of every kind. Uh,
Yeah. Maybe we should define what processing is at first, or at least
totally.
kind of, yeah, explain what that means.
Yep.
So I always explain it kind of like how you prep a food or maybe like season a food. Um, it's basically after the coffee is picked, it needs to get put through a process to take off that cherry and prep it to be roasted. Um, so why don't we just talk? Do you want to start with like washed as like since that's kind of the most common?
Yeah, so washed coffee after the coffee is harvested. Um, there's different ways that it's transported from harvesting to processing stations. Some processing stations are like right on farms.
Yeah,
Sometimes there are some miles away. It just depends. Sometimes they service a lot of different farms. Sometimes producers process coffee at a processing facility that is like part of the farm. It just depends.
yeah,
Um,
all the yeah,
but generally washed coffee through some process again it's different at different stations, but water is used to pull the cherry and the bean apart. So sometimes that's through like sloughs where like the coffee like moves around. Sometimes it's more like it's more of like a pressurized kind of thing where coffee's like kind of pressure washed. It just depends. But the result is you get the bean very clean, separated from the cherry, and then you have a bunch of pulp and cherry that is disposed of, and then you have the beans that are then put out to dry after they've been washed.
and like a lot of times, what they'll do with that cherry is they'll um put it back onto the coffee field to
Right.
actually
Yeah.
fertilize
I say
the
disposed of. It's not necessarily like they just throw it away, but yeah,
right.
it's done. It's no longer part of the process of bringing that coffee to you. Uh,
Exactly.
so it's the easiest way to process coffee because if you think about it, it's you can wash something until it's clean, right? Like there's no there's not a ton of technique to washing the bean because you wash it until there's no more pulp on it and then you put it out to dry. So that's why it tends to be kind of the most common traditionally and the easiest way to do it, especially if you're dealing with a large harvest and lots of
Yes,
coffee at once.
exactly. And like a lot of co-ops will use the wash process because what they do is they take in beans from all over,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and so they're worried about like turning around and getting a
Right.
quicker, you know.
It's definitely faster too, yeah, because you can wash it, dry it, and then you're done, and it goes off to shipping. So yeah, and then the extreme other end is natural coffees,
Yes.
which they let the drying after harvesting, the coffee is just dried with the cherry still on the bean.
Yeah.
Um,
Raisin.
yeah, so it's very much like a raisin. Yeah, like oftentimes like left in the sun or sometimes shade dried, but either way, it's just kind of out in the air, and it means that a lot of the flavor from the cherry is then imparted into the bean because the
Mhm.
bean is absorbing the that pulp and the mash from like the inside of the cherry as it dries.
Totally. And like the resulting flavor usually gives you like say it's really interesting because I wish you could like, I wish every coffee like that was natural came with like a little bit of the cherry just for you
Totally,
to
yeah,
experience that. But basically that's what's you're experiencing in the actual cup. The taste of that berry is what's kind of getting dried and absorbed into that coffee bean itself. And
yep,
so a lot of times the resulting cups are going to be very jam like strawberry, blueberry, anything you'd see kind of in that style is usually result.
yeah. And I think that sometimes people have a bit of an aversion to it, in part because to them it tastes um like like
Fermented.
fermented, yeah, like fermented berries and fruits and stuff, and like I can kind of get that, you know, there you might recoil a little bit at the idea of like I'm gonna drink this coffee that at one point was just sitting out in the air and having the fruit get all like dried and around it, but
So funny.
it's still, I mean, it still goes through the same roasting process, so
Oh, yeah,
it's
yeah. And it's like naturals are my favorite.
oh,
Like
me
I'm that
too, yeah,
person that tried naturals and like to this day they're still like I'll
yeah,
take a natural over anything else. But they're like they're more I don't want to say pungent because it's not like a negative thing, but they're more like in your face
totally,
flavor-wise, you know?
yeah,
I think that's what some people don't like about them. Like one of our coworkers always, every time we try a natural, he's like, "Oh, yum! Can't wait to drink some fermented grapes or whatever or
yeah,
something like that." And to me, it's just totally not like that at all. Like we have, anytime we have a coffee with like a blueberry that's natural with a blueberry note, I like
oh, same, yeah.
inside. Like I just love that.
The only thing I like tea notes a little bit more than the strong blueberry, but that's it. Like otherwise, you give me a really tasty natural that has a really strong blueberry, and that's the best. But
Totally.
it is if you're used to drinking more balanced coffee, it can be a bit of a shock at first, for sure. But there's a lot of it doesn't use as much water, which is good for the environment, especially in some coffee producing areas where water is already kind of a commodity.
Mhm.
And what's so interesting culturally is that, as you were saying about co-ops using washed processes to process a lot of beans, in some places where that are more arid climates,
Yep.
it's out of necessity that naturals are processed the way they are too. So so kind of cultural landscape and the environment has a lot to do with how you choose what kind of processing to do. And then
Yeah.
the third of these processes is like that you mentioned is becoming more popular is what's called a honey process. And there's another name for it that escapes me at the moment that I've seen too. Um,
Um, purple. There's sometimes they're called like pulp naturals
yeah, I
or
think pulp natural is what I'm thinking of. And it's different because they remove uh, and you can help me if I'm off a little bit, but they remove like the skin of the cherry
right.
primarily so that the interior pulp is still on the bean, but it's exposed to the air more.
If you think about any berry, like, yesterday I was eating blueberries, so I'll use that as an example. It has like a skin.
Hmm.
And then, like, if you bite into it or if you like squish it, you can see all the actual like pulp inside of it. And then that's what honey processing is doing. It's removing the skin and allowing that pulp process to come or that pulp to come through. And so the resulting sorry, my dog is right next to me. The resulting coffee experience is basically it creates a honey like texture
Right.
to that pulp. which is how it gets its name. Because,
Right.
you know, the first time I heard of honey process, I definitely thought honey was involved, but it's
No.
just named for that pulp, the way that it looks
Yeah.
after it's removed.
Yeah, and like the consistency and the stickiness of the pulp. But then it's still after that it's kind of dried similarly to a natural after that skin is removed. And I actually am not super clear on the methods used to remove the skin, if it's the same as wash, the way they do it with a wash, just less intense, or if it's more by hand.
So what they do, they have a couple of different methods, and it also depends on, like, you know, the what that farm has access to. But there's a couple different ways that they do it. It's so I learned this recently. When coffee is being transported, a lot of time it's being transported in water anyway. And so if it's being transported in water and like some of that skin kind of comes off while it's in the water, but not all of it, that's one way. And that was kind of how I think this first started happening. But as specialty coffee has been more rewarded, farmers are actually taking the initiative and like saying, oh, okay, I know this coffee has these notes and this type of process will complement the notes. And so say they know that their coffee has some fruity like tendencies and they're trying to get a particular one out, um, they'll do things like pressure wash it and try to just get
Mm-hmm.
some of it off. Or they'll have these like robotic, you know, machines that will be able to
Yeah.
pull it off. And then they do dry it, and like the longer they dry it, the more it's like natural. So
Right.
there's different levels of honey processing as well. And you'll start to see more names. Like I know we've had some with different names like red honey process, black honey process, and yellow. And those are the darker you go, it's more like natural. So
Right.
basically varying degrees of how much fruit punch you want.
Yeah, yeah. And that's kind of the flavor profiles of, like we talked about, you get that fruity berry notes are really strong in naturals. Washed coffees tend to produce more balance and really give you that chocolatey flavor that you might associate with coffee if you're used to if you're not used to exploring these other processes as much. And then a honey can kind of be a mix of both. And really depends on, like you were saying, how long it's dried for. That's
Yeah.
what gives it those different profiles.
And I think honey process is the most interesting to me right now because it can bring you some really unique flavors that you can't get in either one of the other more
Mm-hmm.
common ways.
Mm-hmm.
And so anytime I see a honey process, it gets me kind of intrigued because I'm like, ooh, I don't really know what that's going to taste like. I want to try it out.
Yeah. And it's also, a lot of this is going to depend on, like, the way that the flavors end up in your cup of coffee depends so much on the roaster, and then also on the way that you brew it too.
Totally.
Like I have had some naturals from an espresso machine that are very good that way when prepared by someone who really knows what they're doing. For me, it's pretty hard for me to dial in a natural and get a good flavor out of it in an
And for
espresso machine.
totally. And for most owners, pardon me, or home users,
Hmm.
the effort that it takes to dial in a natural is probably a little bit more effort than you're going to want to do.
Yeah.
It's definitely possible, and I do it at home when I'm feeling like extra dorky. But you know, if you get blends or something with more balanced notes that are easier to pull out at different grind sizes, like in that range, you'll get better coffee easier. Um, Mostly it's just going to be about the effort involved,
Yeah.
and it's easier to get something with those like chocolate notes in that range.
Yep. Whereas naturals are like really good in a pour over, for example. That's in my favorite way to drink that kind of coffee. You can get some of those flavors out of a drip brewer or a press, but generally I think of naturals as like the pour over coffee. And
I think
then,
that's it too.
yeah, and then I used washed beans more in like my drip brewer, and if I'm brewing espresso or in a super auto, that kind of thing. And then
Yeah.
honey processed coffees it's varies so much, like you were saying, from the different, like how long it's been dried. You can get them that are almost like a natural that you want to brew as a pour over, or they can be almost as balanced as something like a washed, and it's really easy to use them in a espresso machine or a drip brewer.
If you remember our roast of the month that was when we did the two, we had the honey and the washed.
Mm-hmm.
I had those both as espresso because I remember we talked about, trying them out.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting because it was the same coffee, so basically from the same farm, but produced in different ways, which is common if they also have a large batch. And so you get to see how that processing affects that coffee. And so while the washed one was good, it was more balanced. The the honey one had much more of like a cola punch
Yeah.
than the wash did, and it was really surprising.
Yep. Yeah. So it's again down to preference, but also that's kind of a rough. That's why we recommend different coffees for different brew methods on the site, is because it's to give you some kind of advice as to how they're going to work in the different styles.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well,
That's processing for you.
yeah.
We are by no means the absolute experts, but we hope that was super helpful for you, at least when you're going to go choose your coffee. You have a little bit more knowledge about what you are looking at. If you have any questions, put them in the comments below. We'd be happy to answer. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah. See ya.